Yes, it's that time again. I'm back for part 3 of Shocktober 2018. It's about time you start carving your jack-o'-lanterns and decorating the house, but first, you'll stay here and listen to me talk about spooky things for another 10 minutes. Last time we spoke about the Abrahamic religions and the concept of Satan and demons. Today, we'll be exploring ghosts and other ways that evil and death has manifested itself in folklore. I'll see you after this very stupid intro. In the first episode, I asked what it is that we find so fascinating about death and darkness. As I've shown, we've tackled this question in many different ways throughout our history and our different cultures, and this will be seen today as well. Many of us love to watch horror films. It's some of the most successful films in the box office. These are films that deal with ghosts, demons, and the afterlife. We seem to be drawn to the dark and the macabre. At least some of us appear to be very interested in these things, and perhaps this says something about our human nature. We will all die someday. This is a fact that's impossible to avoid, and it's always there at the back of our minds and as a part of our consciousness, this idea that we are mortal beings. And to some people, this is the most frightening thing in the world. It's very common to be anxious about death, and I would argue on some level we all are, but on differing levels. The probably earliest known great piece of literature is called the Epic of Gilgamesh. It comes from Mesopotamia and was written around 2000 BC. And one of the main aspects of its story deals with the character Gilgamesh and his quest to find the secret to eternal life. So clearly, this was on the minds of people 4,000 years ago as well. In any case, our culture since then has been crawling with stories about death and the monsters that are related to it. From demons to zombies, vampires, and of course, regular old ghosts. The definition of what a ghost is of course pretty hard to pin down, and I don't think we should get caught up in linguistics in this video, so we'll just consider ghosts to be, ghosts. We all know what ghosts is. It's the spirit of a dead person that comes back and haunts the living. This of course directly relates to our ideas about the afterlife. If ghosts are indeed real, then there must be an afterlife, and if you believe in ghosts, then on some level at least, you must believe in a life after this one. Ghosts are sometimes evil and sometimes not. The most important part is that they're dead and that they're still somehow around. And let's be honest, in almost every case they are evil, or at the very least scary. Japan is famous for its horror films that were especially popular around the turn of the 21st century. And these include films like The Ring and Ju-on the Grudge and many more. But stories like these aren't new to Japanese culture. In fact, Japan has a very long history of telling ghost stories called kaidan, and many of these films are taken directly or at least inspired by many of these storytelling traditions. Much like our European conception of ghosts, the Japanese equivalent, which is often called a Yurei, and please excuse all pronunciations from now on, is the spirit of a dead person that has been kept from a peaceful afterlife. They are stuck in a kind of purgatory in between our world and the next, and is thus able to haunt the living. The funeral is very important for the well-being of a spirit after death, and the way in which the person died also plays a major role. If everything goes well, including the funeral, then the spirit can move on to the afterlife and sort of be at peace. However, if the person died in a very violent way, like if he was or she was murdered or committed suicide, then something else happens. The spirit will then often become a yurei, a kind of ghost driven by emotions of hatred and revenge as a result of the way in which they died. They can then enter our world and enact that revenge on the person who killed them, or just on anyone that happens to come in their way, which is actually often the case in these stories. For those of you who have seen some of these Japanese horror films, these themes will seem very familiar to you. In The Ring, for example, the ghost of a dead girl who was murdered by being tossed into a well haunts and kills anyone who watches a specific videotape. The way in which she died made her a vengeful spirit that seeks to enact revenge on the living. Similarly, in Ju-on the Grudge, the ghost of a mother and her child who were brutally murdered in their house haunts anyone who enters said house. They are both very frightening and dark stories that take heavy inspiration from the traditional ghost stories of Japan. In many of these cases, the spirit or ghost can be freed or released by helping it achieve its purpose by, for example, enacting revenge on those who killed them, but in many cases even this doesn't help. Another significant and interesting detail is the appearance. In old theatrical performances of ghost stories in Japan, the ghost or Yurei were eventually given a very characteristic look to emphasize that they were ghosts. 1. They always had long, unkempt black hair, and 2. They were often dressed in white, sort of funeral or burial clothing. Again, we can here see clear influences on modern Japanese horror films. The image of a woman dressed in white with long black hair has become characteristic of that kind of film. In one of the more famous kaidan or ghost stories from Japanese tradition, called The Dish Mansion at Bansho, it tells of a servant girl called Okiku, who works for a samurai. The samurai falls in love with her and at multiple occasions makes advances towards her, but she always refuses. He then comes up with a plan and makes it seem like the servant has lost one of the family's priceless plates. She desperately tries to find it, as the punishment for such a crime would normally be death. The samurai then offers to pardon her on the terms that she would become his lover. But she refuses once again, and the samurai becomes so angry that he throws her down a well, killing her. As a result of this terrible death, the ghost of the servant comes back to haunt the samurai, every now and then letting out a terrible scream. It becomes so bad that the samurai has to seek help to rid him of this terrible situation. At the very other side of the world, at least if you follow this flat map, in Mexico there's a very interesting festival or celebration that is strongly associated with death. This is the holiday often known as Day of the Dead. The origin of this festival is contested, with some scholars arguing that it has origins in Aztec culture. But during this holiday, which is celebrated for several days, friends and family gather to remember and honor those who have died, often visiting graves with gifts of food or other objects. It bears some similarity to the Christian holiday of All Saints' Day that is celebrated in many other parts of the world. This is a time when people consciously come into contact with death by remembering those who have passed away and also indirectly reminding oneself of our own mortality. It is said that the Day of the Dead is a very happy and festive occasion, and thus it can function as a way of approaching death in a celebratory fashion. Likewise, here in Europe we have a lot of ghost stories as well, often including haunted houses or objects. But if we move away for a second from the traditional ghost, we can start exploring another creature from Northern European and Scandinavian folklore. One of the most prominent characters you'll find here is known as the Mare. The Mare is an evil being that visits people at night. There are many stories told throughout Scandinavia, Germany, and the Slavic world that tells of the Mare terrorizing people as they sleep. The Mare doesn't have a particular form, but it is a being that can take on many different forms. Like animals, it can look like a horse, like a cat, or just simply as a dark mass. But perhaps the most common way of perceiving the Mare through these stories that are told is as a woman. What is peculiar about this legend is that people often experience the Mare as sitting on their chest, which creates a great feeling of anxiety and often trouble of breathing. And I know a lot of you are thinking about sleep paralysis right now, and that's a very interesting point. During sleep paralysis, people often tell how they experience these beings standing above them or in many cases creatures sitting on their chest. In folklore from this region of the world, sleep paralysis, among other things, are probably conceptualized into the mare, giving it a mythological expression. Furthermore, the mare is thought to be the cause of nightmares, so she could be haunting you without you even knowing it. And this connection between nightmares and this legend can be clearly heard in the name itself, nightmare. And this is pretty universal to European languages. For example, in Swedish, the mare is known as maran, and the word for nightmare is mardröm, which literally translates to mare dream. I was in an archive in a museum not long ago, and I was looking at old sort of documents and letters from a region in Sweden where I grew up partly, and I discovered there that a lot of these documents talk about sightings of the mare, and these were only about 100 years old. So even though most people don't talk or think about the mare, it still lingers in our culture and remains as part of our history. And so perhaps she is still out there somewhere and maybe standing over your bed tonight as you sleep. Speaking of which, I recently heard a ghost story that runs within my own family. This takes place around the turn of the last century and in a part in western Sweden where I partly grew up. It was a winter's day and my great-great-grandfather or something like that was on his way home from work. But as he was walking along one of the roads, he saw his wife out in the field. And she was jumping around in a strange way from left to right. And he was very confused and thought this was strange, so he called out to her, but she wouldn't answer him. She just kept jumping, and eventually she disappeared behind the tree line. And he of course still thought this was very strange, but he kind of shook it off and kept walking home. And as he came home, he told his friends and family who were there what he had seen, that he had seen his wife jumping around in this field, and he asked them if they knew what she was doing, why she was out there. And the people there were shocked, and they told him, "Don't you know? Your wife died earlier today in a drowning accident." Ghost stories like these are apparent all over folklore all around the world. There is something about our fascination with death and the afterlife that compels us to wonder and sometimes shiver at the possibilities. This theme will be continued in the next episode when I'll be talking about the long-awaited holiday of Halloween, as well as some of our most beloved pop culture monsters. I'll see you then. Ah!